A steam locomotive taking on water. In the early years of the United States, this scene was common. Today, the railroad water tank, along with the steam locomotives it served, has almost vanished entirely. On the border of New Mexico and Colorado, there is a very unique railroad. A place where the past mingles with the present. Where people can touch living history. This is the story of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. In the southern Colorado town of Antonito, a ritual is practiced every summer morning that is as old as the American West. A steam locomotive couples onto its train, and the passengers pile aboard.
The train this morning is scheduled to depart the station here at Antonito at 10 o'clock, arriving up at Osier, Colorado, our Midway Point inland stop, this afternoon at 1 o'clock, with one intermediate stop at Sublette, New Mexico.
Upon departure from Antonito, the trains begin heading west. Passengers work their way to the open car to enjoy the climb into the mountains. Even as the train from Antonito is underway, at the other end of the line in Chama, New Mexico, crowds watch the morning switching in preparation for one of the most famous trips in all of North American railroading, the 14-mile double-headed climb to the top of the Cumbres Pass. Chama is an old railroad town. The trains have always been a part of this small New Mexican community. In recent years, however, this sleepy area at the base of the San Juan Mountains has witnessed a new boom on the railroad. Every morning during the summer months, Chama is host to an invasion of tourists, each one eager to climb aboard and ride into history. Today's Cumbres and Toltec is a true Western monument. As is the case with many things of a historical nature, its beginnings can be traced to one person. In this instance, the railroad owes its very existence to General William Jackson Palmer. In 1870, General Palmer decided to build a railroad south from Denver to Mexico City, in the belief that he could open a great new trade artery between the United States and Mexico. When General Palmer began constructing his new railroad, which he named the Denver and Rio Grande, he made one decision which would affect the line from then on. Palmer decided to build his railroad narrow gauge, with rails only 3 feet apart, rather than use the accepted standard gauge with 4 feet, 8 1/2 inches between the rails.
The whole precept was based on the fact that narrow gauge construction was a good deal less expensive than standard gauge construction. And in those early days, the narrow gauge freight cars had very near the same capacity as standard gauge equipment did. You could carry essentially the same loads. You couldn't go as fast, but you could save money on the construction and initial capital investment.
The Rio Grande began building south from Denver, down the front range of the Rocky Mountains, past Colorado Springs and Pueblo. It wasn't long, though, before General Palmer and the Rio Grande ran into a problem.
Unfortunately, as the Rio Grande built south from Denver, the Santa Fe Railroad, then building west across southern Colorado to Pueblo, they won the race to get a railroad line surveyed and staked out and so on over Raton Pass, just south of Trinidad at the state line. That foiled the general and his plans and forced the Rio Grande to head into the mountains. They still had ideas of going south. They planned to go down through the San Luis Valley. They were going to go south, bypassing Santa Fe by a few miles and on down to El Paso. But they got into mostly a legal battle with the Santa Fe Railroad over building a line through the Royal Gorge. The Rio Grande won, but as one of the offshoots of winning, there was a general agreement made between three major companies that the Rio Grande would not go more than, I believe it was 100 miles south of Colorado. And the agreement permanently ended plans to go to El Paso and on to Mexico City.
Suffering a major setback at the hands of the Santa Fe, the Rio Grande was able to bounce back rather quickly with the news that silver had been discovered in the San Juan Mountains.
And from there on out, why, everything started booming. The San Juans opened up. They had survey crews and engineering parties out all over Colorado. They built railroads like it was going out of style.
One of the new lines that the Rio Grande began constructing was a line to connect the booming mining areas around Silverton, Colorado, with the rest of the nation. From Alamosa, Colorado, the line worked south, splitting from the line to Santa Fe at Antonito and snaking its way to the summit at Cumbres Pass before dropping down the steep 4% grade into Chama, New Mexico. From Chama, the line went west to Durango, then north into the mountains and to Silverton. Once the new railroad to Silverton was completed, trains became very busy hauling ore out of the region. Business was going very well for the Rio Grande until the silver panic of 1893 hit. After the panic, silver prices began falling at an alarming rate.
The railroad from then on had to exist on the ordinary commodities of coal, lumber, livestock, and that kept the railroads alive. However, it had the effect of management not having money to put back in those lines. So as late as the 1950s, you had original locomotives of the 1880s still in use.
Even before the panic, the Rio Grande had already determined that General Palmer had made a mistake when he made the railroad narrow gauge. A program was started to convert the major lines of the railroad to standard gauge. Although plans were discussed to widen the line over Cumbres, this was never done. The railroad over Cumbres, known as the San Juan Extension, continued to have its ups and downs over the years until it was finally abandoned in 1970. At that time, the states of Colorado and New Mexico bought the scenic 64 miles of the line from Chama to Antonito to save for future generations to enjoy. And enjoy people do, as the double-headed train departs Chama and begins fighting its way up to Cumbres Pass. Leaving Chama, the crews on both locomotives get things in order before the train hits the hill. A couple of miles east of Chama, The train reaches the 4% grade, and the railroaders go to work. Four miles east of Chama, the train pulls by the siding at Lobato, New Mexico, where a Hollywood movie set has stood for many years. Just past the siding is the second highest trestle on the railroad, known as Lobato Trestle. Here, the helper locomotive cuts off of the train to cross the bridge by itself. The load limit of the bridge will not permit two locomotives to be on it at the same time. Once the helper locomotive is on the other side of Lobato Trestle, the road locomotive brings the rest of the train across, with the passengers getting a chance to gaze down 100 feet to Wolf Creek. Once the train has reached the far side of the bridge, the helper backs down and couples onto the train. From here on, the train blasts its way up the hill to Cumbres. The line from Chama to the top of Cumbres Pass has always been an area where helper locomotives were stationed to assist trains up the steep 4% grade. Today, many trains of the Cumbres and Toltec still need two locomotives to make it to the top of the hill. To the casual observer, watching a doubleheader may be interesting, but to the crews running the train, it is plain hard work.
It's tough. It's tough. Slip a lot, just a lot of sand. Sometimes you even get stalled out and have to back down and go up again. That has happened to me once. You know, it might just take a notion and do it here. Where did it yesterday may not do it. You just don't know. Just have your hand on the sand dirt. You start slipping, just turn on the sand, and you're still slipping, you shut the throttle down and jerk her wide open again. And usually that takes care of it.
Firemen keep hot. I like to see the seam pressure right under the pop-off point, which is the safety valve, which is set at 195 pounds per square inch. So he likes to see it right up there all the time, so he's got full power. Going up the hill is a challenge for the firemen. You gotta throw coal in, spread it around in the firebox. You don't want to heap it up in one place. So the idea is to get a pattern going and follow the pattern around until you keep the fire going evenly through the whole thing. You probably shovel about 2 tons in an hour and 10 minutes.
Going to the top of the pass may be difficult at times, but the crews think highly of the locomotives.
They're nice. You make a couple adjustments with a Johnson bar and it responds, and They're really nice engines to run. They're nice engines to fire. So they're pretty good. Oh, mercy, I love it. You know, it's been a lifelong dream for me to do this. And I finally got the opportunity. I worked at a mine up in Climax, Colorado for 24 years. I quit to come down here.
A doubleheader between Chama and Cumbres is certainly fascinating to watch, but not every train has two locomotives. Many trains are dispatched with only one engine up front. This makes for some spectacular railroading as the single locomotive is worked to capacity. Back on board the doubleheader, the passengers are enjoying the trip through the Aspen Grove near the water tank at Cresco, Colorado. From here on, the railroading is dramatic as the train begins its final assault on the summit.
Just around this next bend to the left, we will be coming into Cumbres Pass, the highest point along the line. It sits at 10,015 feet above sea level.
1 hour and 10 minutes after departing Chama, the train approaches the top of the hill at the station known as Cumbres. Ever since the line was constructed, there has been a small collection of railroad facilities at this lonely mountain station.
It was strictly a railroad community, and there were not really very many people that stayed there, especially through the winter. There would be the section hands and the telegraph operator, and a man by the name of Lively was up there for a number of years, and he took a lot of interesting winter snow pictures, some of which are in Ticket to Toltec, and some that Lamont Ballou took the same time frame, early 1900s. But I don't think it was ever anything but just a railroad stopping place.
Cumbres was a strategic station on the Rio Grande since it was at the top of a grade from either direction. Trains from Alamosa, Antonito in the east had a long 1.5% climb to Cumbres, and trains from Chama encountered the steep 14 miles of 4% grade. Even up to the last days that the Rio Grande operated the line, morning in Chama took on a special flavor as locomotives were prepared for the climb to the top of the pass. Typical operations would find one locomotive at the front of the train while a helper labored from the rear. Trains coming into Chama from Durango would usually be broken into several parts, with two locomotives making as many trips as required to get the entire train to the summit. Today, Cumbres is not as busy as it used to be, but one can still pause to watch the helper being set aside and one locomotive taking the train down the other side of the hill toward Antonito. The railroad changes once the train has crossed Cumbres Pass. Passengers have new scenery to enjoy as the train glides through the subalpine area east of the pass. For most of the trip out of Chama, the train has been in the view of the highway. After the rails make the big loop near the Los Pinos water tank, the train disappears into the mountains. Weather in the mountains can change abruptly. Only a few miles east of Los Pinos, it is raining as the train crosses the highest bridge on the line, Cascade Trestle. On the other end of the railroad, the Antonito train is making the long westward climb toward Cumbres. Leaving Antonito, the train is in the arid southern portion of the vast San Luis Valley. In order to gain elevation, track surveyors in 1880 decided to have the railroad weave along the sides of every mesa in its path, a decision which people have joked about ever since.
Well, it was a matter of humor that on that line west of Antonito, once they got up past Lava Tank, that the surveyor just turned his mule loose and followed him up along the mountainside and ultimately arrived at Cumbres Pass.
The line does indeed follow a very circuitous path. Between Chama and Antonito, the trains crossed the New Mexico-Colorado border 11 times. One of the things that prompted the states of Colorado and New Mexico to purchase this portion of the narrow gauge in 1970 was the diverse scenery to be found between Antonito and Chama. As the train nears the siding at Bighorn, New Mexico, passengers begin to notice that the scenery has changed from the sagebrush and rabbit brush found near Antonito to an area with ponderosa pine and a few aspen. It is in this area that patrons begin to experience the best scenery on the railroad.
The line beyond Bighorn winds around along the upper rim, the upper portion of a wide mountain valley, almost totally devoid of any kind of population or roads, no town, and provides a magnificent continuing series of views of that sort of country. It probably will always remain that way. The line is almost virtually unchanged from when it was built. The locomotives are somewhat newer and considerably heavier than the original cars, but the scenery is the same as it was in the 1880s, and the general atmosphere is probably the same. The passenger gets the feeling that they are almost pioneering into an area that most of the West's other tourists never heard of and never see. And it's something different.
The first stop since leaving Antonito is at the station in tiny Sublet, New Mexico.
It was built during the days when you had certain sections of the railroad assigned to certain gangs for maintenance. And out of Sublette, the crews would work that end of the railroad, keeping track in shape, keeping obstacles off the track, replacing ties when they were necessary, checking for any other potential danger spots, and repairing them. They simply lived up there year-round.
I read a newspaper article one time about the section hands and the families that lived at Sublette, and how the wives would ride the morning train into Antonito and Alamosa to do their shopping, and then ride the train back out at night, and this was the only way that they had of getting around. They didn't have a car. And it was interesting, different from what we could do today.
Leaving Sublette, the scenery becomes more spectacular by the mile, with the railroad running through thick groves of aspen and the passengers looking over the edge of track into the beautiful Los Pinos Valley. This stretch of line has always been popular with passengers, and for many years the line was served by a passenger train worthy of the route. Known as the San Juan Express, this deluxe train would make the trip daily from Alamosa to Durango. The trains would include a locomotive or two, a railway post office car, baggage car, some coaches, and a first-class parlor dinette car.
Back in this day, it was a real good train. And, you know, back several years ago, sure, it took you like 9 hours to get from Alamosa to Durango. But that's 200 miles, see? Well, when the roads were bad, you couldn't go over the pass anyhow, so actually about the only way they had getting through. And they carried a lot of all the mail, and then we had little stops at different stations, what we call an LCL car. There might be a side of beef hanging a shed for them, or boxes of groceries and stuff like that, these little towns along the way. And we peddled that on the way for years, up until not too long before they pulled it off.
Oh, it was a delightful little train. Gosh sakes. That parlor cars that they used, each of them with a galley. They served great food. The porters on them were excellent chefs. It was quite a joy going off across the country to stop at these little settlements and sidings along the way. Native youngsters would come out, and they were always good for an ice cream cone. Newspapers were delivered that way. It was a fun operation.
The important thing to the train was that in the winter it kept the line open. Those daily trains, 7 days a week, going back and forth with the equivalent of a standard gauge engine and 4 relatively light wooden cars, could plow through snowpack cuts and drifts of that fluffy snow the skiers like, and keep the line open. Well, the first thing the railroad did to kill off the line was to get rid of that passenger train so that freight trains would have difficulties getting across there, and then the cost of opening a line running special snow plowing flanger trains skyrocketed and made the losses pyramid.
On January 31st, 1951, the San Juan Express made its final trip between Alamosa and Durango. For the first time since the line was built, there was no scheduled passenger service on the line.
Coming up just ahead of us now is the first of 2 tunnels. This one is tunnel number 1, or the bus tunnel.
Today, one can still ride over the most spectacular portion of the route traveled by the San Juan, the area near Toltec Gorge. It was along this section of the line that on February 11th, 1948, disaster struck at Phantom Curve.
They had this snow slide hit about 2 cars behind the engine. And it took the baggage car, had a baggage car and a mail car behind the engine. Then we had the 2 coaches and then the parlor car. And the third car, first coach went down, the second one right behind it. The parlor car turned over and it didn't go very far, but the coaches went way down the bottom before they got stopped. And about the only injury, one of the brakemen got, fell over, hit something, and kind of split his head open. That conductor had a little skin place on his head, but none of the passengers, as far as I know, was hurt.
Braving the bitter winter cold is the last thing on the minds of today's passengers as they enjoy some truly beautiful scenery along the line, alternating between Rio Grande National Forest in Colorado and Carson National Forest in New Mexico. Immediately after emerging from Rock Tunnel, the passengers are treated to some truly spectacular scenery as the train eases past Toltec Gorge. Patrons have marveled at this stretch of the railroad for over 100 years. Shortly after negotiating Toltec Gorge, the train enters another area with vastly different scenery. Nearing Osier, Colorado, the train begins to encounter a large grassy area. This part of the forest was destroyed by a large fire in 1879 and has never fully recovered. It was here in 1880 that the Rio Grande established the town of Osier. Today, the station is the central lunch stop for the trains from Chama and Antonito. The train from Chama usually arrives first, winding its way along the mountainside before curving into the ghost town. After the eastbound train from Chama stops, the westbound train from Antonito comes into view. The selection of Osier as the lunch stop on the Coombres and Toltec is certainly an appropriate one, as this location was a lunch stop during the early days of the railroad. Here, the railroad built the usual cluster of buildings and facilities one would expect for such a station. At this site is a small depot, a water tank, section house, stock pens, and a siding. For a time, there was even a small community here.
They had a so-called hotel there at one time. It was called Jenkins Gardens, and it was a guy that had homesteaded there. And he put up people. I don't think it was anything but very primitive. And I think now most of the signs of where his buildings were are gone, but they were up on the hill above where the tracks are. And they used to say that they could swing the election in Conejos County by how many people got off the train at Osier and voted and got back on the train, and maybe did this 2 or 3 times, but they could control the voting this way.
The history to be found along the railroad is very fascinating. However, but for a fluke of events, this entire stretch of line might not have been preserved. After the San Juan was pulled off in 1951, the railroad was in decline. With improved highways in the area, freight traffic began to die.
The time I first went to work for them, of course, was during the Depression. There wasn't much business, maybe a train a day each way. And then oil was discovered in Farmington, and eventually they went beyond the oil-bearing sands and they got into gas.
The pipe movement, of course, was for the oil and related products in the Farmington area. And there was a lot of what they call mud, which are used in their drilling operations, and all the related products that go with oil drilling.
About 1950, we really began to run on the railroad, hauling pipe, other materials for the gas field into the Farmington area.
As the pipe came in, of course, at Alamosa, we had a major transfer. And the transfer was accomplished by removing the pipe, unloading it from the standard gauge cars onto the narrow gauge car. As I recall, during the pipe movement, we would have 1 or possibly 2 trains a day and loads going out. And then it would move over Cumbridge Pass down into Durango, and it required a crew out of Alamosa, and then a crew out of Chama, and then another crew out of Durango up the branch. And at Farmington, they had pipe unloading facilities to handle this, and they went through basically the same type procedure that we did at Alamosa.
Without the passenger train plowing the line twice daily in the winter, the railroad was forced to run its rotary snow plows more frequently to keep the line open.
The cost of running a rotary snowplow train was just unbelievable. And if it were possible to, by operating it once, keep the line open, that would be fine. But invariably, you'd open up the line, and within 3 or 4 weeks it would be closed again. You'd have to go through all that expense again. Meantime, you've gotten the revenue maybe off of 2 or 3 trains was all. And it just was self-defeating.
After the pipe was gone, we finally got to the point for a little while after the pipe movement, 1 train a day, and then tri-weekly, then get down to 1 day a week. And finally we got down, we were just running trains when we could build up enough to pay for it.
On September 18, 1967, the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad at long last filed a petition for abandonment with the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Rio Grande wished to close the narrow gauge line from Antonito through Chama to Durango. Also included was the branch to Farmington, New Mexico. It seemed to all observers that the narrow gauge had finally made its last run into the sunset. By July 1970, the narrow gauge railroad over Cumbres Pass had been officially abandoned. The yards in Chama were silent. The railroad between Durango and Chama was already being removed. The line from Chama to Antonito, however, was intact, and the scrappers stayed away. This section of the route was to be preserved because of a number of people whose dedication to the railroad in 1968 would not let the line die.
We decided that we better get busy on trying to preserve the railroad if we wanted to preserve part of it. So we approached the National Park Service and ran a special train for these people from the National Park Service in November 1968, all the way from Durango to Chama with an overnight stay, and then continuing on to Alamosa. National Park Service was favorably impressed by the railroad and by the scenery it passed through. And it seemed like it was just going to take too long for the Park Service to come up with funds to save the railroad. We decided to approach the states of Colorado and New Mexico to see if there was a possibility there. And so legislation was introduced into the legislature of New Mexico and Colorado, starting in 1969, I believe. And this was quite a project to get two states to join in the purchase of something, much less a railroad. The big day was the 16th of July, 1970, when the check for $500-some thousand was taken by Terry Ross up to the Denver and Rio Grande up in Denver for the actual purchase of the railroad. So on that day in 1970, it was ours. The taxpayers of New Mexico and Colorado owned the railroad.
The two states did indeed own a railroad, one that had no employees and had not been used in nearly 2 years. A large contingent of volunteers took it upon themselves to ready the track for the first train. Throughout this summer, work continued to reopen the line from Antonito to Chama. It was hard work, but the volunteers had a sense of purpose. Everyone believed that their efforts would be very worthwhile. On September 2nd, 1970, the first train of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad departed Antonito behind engine 483, and the two states were in the railroad business. The two states are still in the railroad business today, although the day-to-day operations have been turned over to Kyle Railways. The entire railroad is a true railway museum. The yards in Chama demonstrate this quite well. Located here are the facilities that were used when the railroad was in day-to-day operation. Structures such as the old depot, the coal tower where the locomotives were fueled, and the bunkhouse are all longtime parts of the Chama yard. Most of the freight cars are wooden and date from the turn of the century. The K-36 locomotives, numbered in the 480s, were built as narrow-gauge locomotives in 1925. And have seen service on this section of the Rio Grande since the 1930s. Today, in the new engine shop, one can still watch craftsmen use techniques from the age of steam.
What I'm doing, I'm cleaning these holes so our superheated tube will fit in there. And these holes are a little bit scratched and a little bit rough, so I'm cleaning them to put our tubes will fit in there.
One of the problems associated with operating a living museum like the Cumbres and Toltec is the fact that one is using the very items that are supposed to be preserved.
There's different ways to preserve things, and with steam locomotives, really, the best way to preserve one is to operate it and keep it maintained and keep it in good condition. Now, I suppose that some people would disagree with that and prefer to put them in museums and on a pedestal and just look at them, but it's just not the same thing. You just can't get the feel of it and really understand what it's all about unless you can see one operate.
We like to refer to this entire project as a living museum. What we have here is a railroad doing today what it was designed to do 100 years ago when it was built. We are still running trains as they were run then, though we're hauling a lot more people now than they did then, and we're not hauling any freight. The fact remains we have a museum doing today what it was designed to do. The place is here, the equipment is in place, the buildings are in place all along the line.
One such place is the former section camp at Cumbres. Time, however, has not been kind here. For example, when the two states bought the line, the old snow shed was intact.
The old snow shed, there was no maintenance done on it for years by the railroad. And unfortunately, a few years ago, a portion of it fell down. There's a bare remnant of it. There simply isn't the money at this point. Hence, hopefully someday again the volunteers will have some influence and perhaps restoring what now are, well, the brakeman's house is virtually in ruins. When the railroad walked away from those things, they just left them. And they have simply, the weather, particularly up 10,000 feet, the winters are rough. And unless structures of that kind are maintained carefully, they won't survive the winter.
It is hoped that, in time, measures can be taken that will restore Cumbres to the appearance that one would expect from a museum. Despite the condition of decay that is found at the summit, there is a good restoration effort currently in place on the railroad. A volunteer group known as the Friends of the C&TS Railroad is making much progress in reversing the deterioration of the last years of Rio Grande operation.
We're trying to fulfill the role of the museum aspect of the property, including those jobs that are not done by the operator. We have an excellent operator here now who maintains everything they use, and they do a fine job of that. But there are hundreds of railroad cars in this yard that they do not use. And our job is to maintain the railroad cars, the property, the buildings, those things that are not a part of the active, everyday tourist hauling facility, and keep them as a museum for the public to view and appreciate the fact that we have a 100-year-old museum here. Most of these cars, in fact, have not been painted since 1948. And because they hadn't been painted since 1948, they're really in bad shape. And it's taken 2 or 3 coats of paint even the first time around, and many gallons of paint just for a small surface area because of the extremely deteriorated shape of the wood. One of the things that we see in a 3-pronged approach to this property, one being the preservation physically of this equipment that our volunteers can do. The second is a fundraising program that is very important to the goals of this organization. We hope to raise money so that we can have other pieces of property restored, types of equipment that we cannot restore. They're beyond our expertise. And so fundraising is an extremely important function of the organization. And lastly, the third function is to interpret the property to the public.
Every August, the Friends get together for a work session where old equipment is made to shine once again. At the end of the weekend, the volunteers are rewarded for their efforts as a special freight train is run featuring the restored freight cars. Near Osier, the lunch stop is complete, and the trains are returning passengers to Antonito and Chama. A look at today's Cumbres and Toltec would not be complete without paying tribute to the men who ran the trains in regular service many years ago. Nearly all agree that the narrow gauge railroader was a special breed.
It's a matter of fact that Rio Grande, through their
apprentice system, and prior to that, through the system that they used to bring people up from the ranks, so to speak, to they were well background in their trade, and they could go anywhere.
You may not have been what they call special when you went to work there, but it didn't take you long to get in the groove and learn, you know, that everybody worked together, and that's the way it goes. Well, you couldn't slough off and let somebody do the work because you needed everybody that was there to keep things going smooth. It was just like family. We cooked in the caboose together, and we had our bedrolls on there, and we slept in the caboose. 3 of us, conductor and 2 brakemen, used the caboose. The enginemen didn't have any place to sleep. If you had bad trouble, they could all come in the caboose and sit there, of course.
People that I came to know on the narrow gauge, they were a breed of person that you very seldom see anymore. They were very much dedicated to the railroad. They believed in the railroad. They believed in what they were doing. They were very good at what they were doing. And the conductor, for instance, who was responsible for in charge of the train, he ran the show. People respected him, and they respected him for his authority, and they pretty well done what he said. And I know from a dispatcher's viewpoint, our office depended very much on the experience and the advice of these veteran railroaders that were on the narrow gauge. And in my opinion, there are no better railroaders in the United States than you would have found on the Rio Grande Narrow Gauge Railroad.
The Cumbres in Toltec is indeed a living museum. Trains run over the same roadbed that was pushed through the Rockies in the winter of 1880. The locomotives have all spent many years here. The facilities are original to the property. By late afternoon, the trains are nearing their respective terminals. The passengers still crowd the open car, although for some, there is more to do than watch the scenery. As the trains pull in at the end of the trip, another day is done. Fortunately for this section of the narrow gauge, there will be a tomorrow. The next day will find trains once again blasting their way from both ends of the railroad toward the summit at Cumbres.
For further information on how you can help in the preservation effort on the Cumbres and Toltec, write the Friends of the Cumbres and Toltec at P.O. Box 222, Chama, New Mexico 87520, or the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, P.O. Box 789, Chama, New Mexico 87520. Also available from Railway Productions is the documentary Narrow Rails Still Shine. Take a 1-hour look at both the Durango and Silverton as well as the Cumberson Toltec. The history of the narrow gauge as well as current operations are discussed in this highly acclaimed tape.